Pacific skies, early 1945. The air above the Philippine Sea shimmered with heat. Two worlds were about to collide, one built on pride, the other on precision. Below, scattered clouds drifted over a line of silver aircraft, their propellers carving thin halos through the morning haze. They were American P-51 Mustangs, lean, polished, and fast. But to the Japanese pilots circling high above, they looked unfamiliar, fragile even. The enemy intelligence briefings had called them experimental, underpowered, prone to engine failures. In Tokyo's war rooms, the rumor was simple. The Americans had built a machine too advanced for their own good. At 18,000 feet, the first Zero peeled out of formation, banking into the dive. Its pilot, Lieutenant Haruto Sakamura, had survived more than 60 dogfights. He knew the rhythm of the Pacific air, the way a crippled enemy twisted before falling. This one would be no different, he thought, until the Mustang below suddenly tilted upward. The broken plane climbed, impossibly fast, cutting through the dive like a blade through silk. In seconds, the hunter became the hunted. And high above the clouds, Japanese pilots began to realize that something had changed. The skies they once ruled were no longer theirs. When the Second World War expanded into the Pacific, Japan ruled the air with confidence bordering on arrogance. From 1941 to mid-1942, the Mitsubishi A6M0 was not just an aircraft, it was a revelation. Fast, lightweight, and agile beyond belief. The Zero outturned every Allied fighter that tried to challenge it. In the early months after Pearl Harbor, it delivered a string of stunning victories. From the skies above Malaya to the burning fields of the Philippines and the open waters of Java Sea, its turning radius, climb rate, and range made it seem untouchable. In Japanese eyes, the Zero was not only an aircraft, it was a symbol of national genius, proof that Japan had mastered the skies the way the samurai once mastered the sword. American and British pilots quickly learned to fear it. Their outdated P-40 Warhawks, F-4F Wildcats, and early Spitfires struggled to match its agility. Dogfighting a Zero head-on was suicide. Even when hit, the Japanese pilots' skill and discipline kept them fighting with near-suicidal resolve. They called it Bushido in the air, the spirit of death before dishonor. But the Zero's strength was also its flaw. To achieve such maneuverability, it sacrificed armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, luxuries the Allies took for granted. In the early war years, that didn't matter. The Zero was still too fast and too nimble for slower, heavier opponents. Yet deep within Allied command, engineers and tacticians were already studying captured wrecks and flight reports, searching for a weakness, a way to end Japan's aerial dominance. By 1943, the tide had begun to turn. American industry had awakened. Factories that once made cars and refrigerators now produced fighters by the hour. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, Lockheed P-38 Lightning, and later, the North American P-51 Mustang, began entering service in growing numbers. At first, few believed these new planes could truly challenge the Zero in its own domain, the vast Pacific skies, where agility mattered more than armor. But the Mustang wasn't designed as a dogfighter. It was born as an experiment in endurance and power. Its secret lay not in its frame, but in its heart. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, a British design reforged by American engineering. This single engine would turn the tide of air power forever. And yet, when the first Mustangs appeared, Japanese intelligence dismissed them as unreliable. Fast, perhaps, but fragile and untested in tropical combat. It was a deadly miscalculation, because by the time the Imperial pilots realized what the Mustang truly was, the war had already shifted above them. By late 1943, whispers began to spread through Allied air bases about a strange new fighter with wings like a falcon and an engine that howled differently than anything before. The P-51 Mustang, once written off as a failed British export, was being re-engineered for one purpose: endurance. At first, it was meant for reconnaissance, not combat. Early Allison-engined Mustangs performed well at low altitude, but struggled in the thin air above 15,000 feet, the height where Japanese Zeros ruled. Pilots called it beautiful but broken. That reputation nearly killed the program. Then came the turning point. When engineers at Rolls-Royce and North American Aviation mounted the Merlin engine under its hood, suddenly the P-51 wasn't just fast, it was revolutionary. At 30,000 feet, it could outclimb and outdive nearly anything in the sky. With external tanks, it could escort bombers from Saipan to Tokyo and back, a feat no other fighter in history had achieved. The Mustang's performance shattered expectations. It could cruise longer than any Zero, strike faster, and still return home. But more than its numbers, it was how it felt to fly that defined it. Pilots said it didn't fight the air. It flowed through it. And when armed with 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns, it carried enough firepower to slice through bomber formations or tear apart interceptors in seconds. Meanwhile, in Japan, the once unstoppable Zero was aging. Its lightweight frame could not keep pace with the evolution of war. The Mitsubishi engineers worked desperately to modernize, producing the A6M5 variant with thicker armor and improved speed. But it came too late. Every new improvement added weight, and every pound stole away the one advantage Japan had left: agility. The Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service began to sense the shift during the American return to the Marianas and Philippines. Reports described American bombers appearing with unseen escorts, machines that could dive, climb, and vanish into clouds before Japanese pilots could even close the gap. Some believed the Americans had developed a secret new fuel or hidden turbocharger. Others thought these Mustangs were flown by machines, not men. For many, the first real confrontation came in the skies above Iwo Jima and Okinawa, places where the old code of Bushido met the cold efficiency of modern engineering. There, Japanese pilots who once laughed at Allied heavy fighters found themselves facing opponents who could not only outrun them but outthink them. Planes that turned entire formations in midair with mechanical precision. The age of the lightweight Zero was ending. The age of the high-performance, high-altitude fighter had begun. And soon, in the next phase of the war, Japanese pilots would face a truth more shocking than any defeat: that the broken Mustang could do what no Zero ever could: control the battle from above. For the Japanese fighter pilots of 1944, pride was a weapon as sharp as any blade. They had grown up in the legend of the Zero, told since the early days of the Pacific War, that it was untouchable, unbeatable, invincible in the hands of a true warrior. But by the time the P-51 Mustang appeared over the Pacific, that legend was dying in the sky. Veteran pilots like Saburo Sakai had already noticed it. The new American planes no longer behaved like before. They didn't dive away. They didn't run. They turned inside the Zero's arc and climbed where air should have been too thin for engines to breathe. The first encounters felt like a betrayal of nature itself. In interviews after the war, several Japanese aces recalled their shock. The Mustangs seemed to rise out of the clouds like ghosts. We'd turn, and they'd still be above us. For the American pilots, the emotion was different, a mix of relief and revenge. They had spent years flying inferior aircraft in the Pacific, losing friends to the agile Zeros. Now, in the Mustang, they finally had control. Major John C. Meyer, flying out of Iwo Jima, said, "Once you flew the P-51, you didn't fear anything. The plane itself gave you courage." He described dogfights that lasted seconds, like two swords meeting, one sharper than the other. The human side of this transformation wasn't just about speed or technology. It was about psychology. Every pilot who strapped into a Mustang carried a quiet power. They no longer entered battle as survivors. They entered as hunters. And in those moments, somewhere between clouds and conscience, air combat changed forever. The Merlin engine, a British creation refined by Rolls-Royce and produced under license by Packard in America, was the soul of the new Mustang. It wasn't just powerful, it was intelligent. Superchargers allowed it to maintain thrust at high altitudes where air pressure dropped. That single innovation erased the Mustang's greatest flaw and gave the Allies a fighter that could fly faster, higher, and farther than anything Japan possessed. The Zero's Sakai 21 engine, by contrast, had no supercharger. It relied on lightness to achieve maneuverability, a strength that now became its death sentence. As the P-51 climbed beyond 25,000 feet, the Zeros gasped for air. The Mustang also brought a new philosophy of warplane design, one that combined range, speed, and survivability. Self-sealing fuel tanks, armor around the cockpit, and efficient aerodynamics meant a pilot could take damage and still come home. For Japanese pilots, damage meant death. To them, the P-51 wasn't just an enemy. It was unfair technology, a machine that bent the rules of war they'd known. They were fighting the future, while still flying the past. The irony was cruel. The Japanese had once pioneered aviation innovation. But by 1944, they were being outflown by a fighter the Allies had once considered a failure. The broken Mustang had become the ultimate predator of the Pacific. The P-51 Mustang didn't just outperform the Zero, it outthought it. Tactics that once doomed American pilots were now reversed. Instead of tight turns and evasive dives, the Mustangs relied on vertical combat, climbing into the sun, rolling into a dive, and striking from above before the Zero could react. At altitudes above 20,000 feet, the Zero's controls stiffened, its engine choked, and its wings fluttered under pressure. The Mustang, with laminar flow wings and a strong frame, stayed stable and deadly. American formations began to use altitude like a weapon, circling high above Japanese patrol routes, waiting for the Zeros to appear below. When they dived, they didn't just attack, they dictated the terms of battle. Japanese pilots soon realized the terrifying truth. Every engagement was now on American terms. Major James Tapp, leading missions from Iwo Jima, described it simply: the Mustang didn't fight, it chose when to fight. The Japanese response was desperate. They began flying at night, hiding among clouds, or using kamikaze tactics when dogfighting proved impossible. But none of it changed the outcome. The Mustang had transformed the Pacific Air War from a duel of skill into a contest of altitude and speed, and America now owned both. Behind the Mustang's rise was a leadership shift, one that reflected the new realism of Allied command. In late 1943, General Henry Hap Arnold approved the integration of the British Merlin engine into the American airframe, despite objections from engineers who feared compatibility issues. It was a gamble, and it paid off beyond measure. Under Curtis LeMay, Mustangs were not merely fighters. They became strategic guardians. Their long range allowed them to escort B-29 bombers deep into Japan, where no fighter had gone before. Every bomber formation that once lost dozens of planes now returned nearly intact. It was the birth of escort dominance, a concept that changed the psychology of war. Even Japanese leadership took notice. In April 1945, intercepted communications from Tokyo revealed a rare admission: the enemy's new fighter renders interception futile. The line was never meant for propaganda. It was despair captured in transmission. From an engineering decision came a strategic revolution, one that turned a failed fighter into the backbone of Allied air supremacy. For Japan, air combat had always been about spirit, the courage of the pilot, the purity of the fight. Victory was supposed to come from honor, not machinery. But by 1944, that philosophy had met its end. The Mustang represented the cold truth of modern warfare, that technology had outgrown valor. No amount of bravery could outclimb a supercharged Merlin engine. No legend of the Zero could outturn a machine that didn't need to. In private, captured Japanese officers confessed their frustration. We fought with our hearts. They fought with their factories. It was not arrogance. It was evolution. The war had entered a new phase where production lines, not pilots, decided battles. The Mustang was proof that the Industrial Revolution had taken flight. The human spirit still burned in the cockpit, but now it burned inside metal and gasoline, not flesh and pride. And as both sides came to terms with that, the next stage of air warfare was about to begin, where the Mustang's dominance would be tested not by the Zero, but by the relentless sky itself. March 1945, over the Pacific, near the island of Kyushu, a formation of B-29 bombers thundered toward the Japanese mainland, their silver wings catching the morning sun. Above them, like silent sentinels, flew the P-51 Mustangs, long-range escorts fresh from Iwo Jima. For the first time in the war, American bombers were not flying in fear. They were flying in confidence. Below, Japanese radar screens flickered with dots. Enemy inbound. Scramble orders echoed through airfields carved from volcanic soil. Pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service raced to their aircraft, A6M Zeros, worn but still revered. The rising sun glowed red on their wings as they took off, one by one, into a sky they once ruled. At 25,000 feet, the two worlds collided. The Japanese pilots believed they still had an edge. The Zero's legendary maneuverability, its tight turns, its nimble response. But when they climbed to intercept, the Mustangs didn't meet them head-on. They rose higher, climbed faster, and vanished into the glare of the sun. Seconds later, the sky broke open. From above, the P-51s dove like thunderbolts. Their .650 caliber Browning machine guns lit up the air with streaks of fire. The Zeros scattered, twisting into evasive loops. But the Mustangs never stayed long enough to be caught. They climbed again, turning the battlefield vertical. The Japanese formations broke apart, each pilot forced to fight alone. A death sentence in the new air order. One Zero tried to climb to meet a Mustang head-on, but its engine sputtered, its wings shuddering under the stress. The American fighter soared past, inverted, and shredded the Zero's tail with a single burst. For the men watching from the B-29s below, it was surreal. The hunters of the Pacific, the aircraft that once terrorized every American, were now being hunted in open daylight. Major Jack Snodgrass, flying escort that day, later said, "They came at us like before, confident, tight formations, but by the time they reached bombing altitude, half were gone. We didn't outnumber them. We just outclimbed them." In less than 10 minutes, the battle was decided. Japanese command lost 14 aircraft in that single encounter. The Americans lost none. But this wasn't just another air victory. It was the symbolic death of the Zero's legend. Word spread fast across Japanese bases. Pilots whispered that the Americans had found a new superplane, one that could dive faster than any Zero, climb past the limits of the sky, and strike before it was seen. It was no rumor. It was the Mustang. By April, even Admiral Toyoda Soimu, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, admitted that the air war was beyond salvation. No matter how bravely his men fought, their machines could not follow. The Japanese tried everything: lighter fuel loads, stripped armor, emergency intercepts at dawn. But nothing changed the outcome. Each sortie ended the same way, their fighters falling in spirals of smoke, while the Mustangs disappeared into the sun. To make matters worse, the B-29 raids became daily reality. And wherever the bombers went, the P-51s were already there, circling above, invisible until it was too late. The psychological toll was devastating. Japanese radio intercepts captured one pilot's final words before his transmission cut off mid-scream. "They climb. Too fast. They're already above us." That was the last thing he ever said. By May 1945, the Japanese Air Force no longer launched coordinated interceptions. Every pilot who took off knew he was unlikely to return. The skies over Japan had become a one-sided domain, an empire of altitude controlled entirely by the Mustang Air Formation, like hawks through doves. From his command post, Admiral Ugaki watched in disbelief. Radar screens once filled with friendly aircraft were now emptying faster than they could report. "They don't break," one officer muttered. "They don't turn back." And it was true. The Mustangs could fly farther, faster, and higher than anything Japan could muster. They escorted bombers all the way from the Marianas to Tokyo, a range once thought impossible. The Japanese air defense system, built around intercepting short-range raids, simply collapsed. No warning, no recovery. By spring of 1945, Japan's airfields had become graveyards of metal and ash. Every sortie ended in loss. Every mission returned lighter than it left. If it returned at all, the Imperial Command grew desperate. Factories couldn't build fighters fast enough. Fuel reserves were dwindling. And worst of all, morale was gone. That was when a new kind of order came down. Cold, final. If they couldn't win the sky, they would die in it. Thus began the era of the kamikaze. Young men, some barely 20, were told that a single plane, driven by faith and fire, could succeed where strategy had failed. They wrote letters to their mothers, tucked cherry blossoms into their flight suits, and took off knowing they would never return. But even that, too, was swallowed by the inevitable. The Mustangs met them in the air, swift and silent, ending each story before it could strike. The empire that once dreamed of mastering the Pacific skies had lost them, not in a single battle, but in the cold arithmetic of technology. The pilots still fought, the flags still waved, but somewhere above the clouds, the sky itself had already chosen its victor. When the last engines quieted over Tokyo Bay, Japan's skies were no longer fields of glory. They were mirrors of ruin. Hangars stood empty, their doors hanging open to the wind. The runways that once echoed with the proud roar of the Zero now lay cracked and silent, streaked with oil and forgotten shells. By mid-1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, once the deadliest aerial force in the Pacific, had been reduced to fragments. Barely 100 operational fighters remained to defend an empire that had spanned thousands of miles. Reports from surviving pilots told the same story. They couldn't reach the bombers. They couldn't catch the Mustangs. And when they tried, they never came back. American engineers had done what the Japanese High Command never expected. They had solved the range problem. With drop tanks and efficient engines, the P-51 had turned every bomber mission into a one-way siege. No island, no city, no airfield was out of reach. The skies above Tokyo, once thick with interceptors, had turned into corridors for B-29 superfortresses, escorted by Mustangs flying like sentinels on the horizon. The bombing campaigns grew systematic, industrial, not strikes of anger, but operations of inevitability. Entire districts of Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya burned in firestorms that erased the line between soldier and civilian. From the ground, people watched the night sky glowing red, not from the sunrise, but from their cities being consumed. In the Japanese command centers, silence replaced argument. The enemy's superiority was no longer debated. It was accepted, grimly, as fact. The once invincible Zero, the symbol of Japan's warrior spirit, had become a relic, a museum piece before the war even ended. Its light frame, once a marvel of agility, was useless against the armor and speed of late-war American fighters. Even the kamikaze missions, born of desperation, began to lose effect. For every bomber they struck, dozens more arrived the next day, protected by Mustangs that seemed to appear from nowhere. And when the surrender came, that radio broadcast from Emperor Hirohito on August 15, 1945, the pilots who had survived stood beside the wrecks of their planes, listening. Some wept, some stood in silence, others simply looked up at the sky one last time, the same sky they had sworn to defend. Because by then, they all understood. The air war had ended long before the surrender. It had ended the moment the broken P-51 appeared and never stopped climbing. In the months that followed Japan's surrender, the skies over the Pacific fell quiet, not with peace at first, but with the eerie calm of exhaustion. The war had ended, but the ghosts of those dogfights still drifted above every island runway, every burned-out city block. American aircraft, the same that had once darkened Japan's skies, now landed on its airfields, bringing not destruction, but supplies, engineers, and the first outlines of reconstruction. Among them were P-51 Mustangs, still gleaming, still operational, now resting on the same tarmac where Zeros had once taken off for war. For Japanese pilots, the transformation was surreal. They studied the captured Mustangs closely, their design, their engine, their control systems. Many who had once sworn to destroy these machines now marveled at their engineering. The supercharged Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the laminar flow wing, the endurance tanks. It was as if the Americans had rewritten the laws of flight mid-war. Under Allied supervision, Japan's aviation industry was dismantled, its factories stripped of military purpose. Mitsubishi's production lines went silent. Nakajima plants were repurposed to manufacture civilian goods. Yet, even in defeat, engineers took notes, learned, and adapted. The lessons of the P-51, its range, efficiency, and aerodynamic precision, became blueprints for Japan's post-war aviation renaissance. Meanwhile, in America, the Mustang became more than a weapon. It became a myth. Newspapers called it the fighter that ended the war. War correspondents described its silhouette as the guardian angel of the bombers. Young pilots who trained after 1945 would sit beside veterans and listen to stories of how a single-engine fighter crossed oceans, fought interceptors head-on, and returned home when none were expected to survive. As jet technology emerged, the P-51 began to fade from frontline service, yet its legacy refused to die. It had proven something fundamental, that speed, altitude, and range could coexist without compromise. It was not just a victory of design. It was a victory of intellect, of industry, of adaptation under pressure. Across the Pacific, former Japanese and American pilots, enemies who once hunted each other through clouds, eventually met again, years later, at air shows and memorials. They spoke of respect, of skill, of the shared madness of youth. Some even shook hands beneath the restored wings of a Mustang, hearing once again the deep growl of its Merlin engine. History had come full circle. The war that had divided them had also bound them in a single truth, that technology had changed the sky forever. And as one Japanese veteran once said, standing beside a polished P-51 decades later, "We thought we ruled the air. Then we met the future." In the quiet after the war, when smoke cleared and factories turned to silence, a truth began to settle across the world. Air power had rewritten the nature of warfare. The P-51 Mustang was more than a machine. It was a message. It proved that human will and engineering could combine to reshape the very balance of the sky. Where once the Zero had symbolized unmatched agility and grace, the Mustang represented endurance, evolution, and mastery of science under pressure. It bridged oceans, it crossed frontiers, and it ended myths. For Japan, the defeat was devastating but transformative. The very principles that once destroyed its air force became the foundation of its rebirth. Within 2 decades, the same engineers who studied the fallen Zero and the victorious Mustang helped Japan rise again. This time not as a conqueror, but as a builder of machines that symbolized precision and peace. For the United States, the P-51 became an icon, a steel-winged embodiment of what coordination, innovation, and sacrifice could achieve. It stood as proof that courage in the cockpit was only part of victory. The greater triumph lay in learning, adapting, and never underestimating the enemy. And in that evolution, from rivalry to respect, the world found something rare, a lesson written not in glory, but in understanding. The war had shown how fragile dominance could be, how quickly innovation could turn the hunter into the hunted. The P-51 Mustang didn't just outclimb the Zero, it outlasted an era. And in the calm that followed, As nations rebuilt and skies opened once more, humanity learned a lesson that endures to this day, that every great weapon, every technological leap, carries within it both the power to destroy and the potential to define the peace that follows.